So before I get going, Food and Water Watch is a national consumer advocacy group. Formerly, we were part of an organization called Public Citizen. Are you guys familiar with them? Yes. Okay, figured. We advocate for funding for water infrastructure. More federal funding for water infrastructure, the idea being that when communities are starved for assistance, that they turn to privatization. We help communities advocate against privatizing their municipal water systems. And then we also challenge, try to educate folks about bottled water and some of the bottled water harms, because we view that as another form of water privatization, corporate privatization. So what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about, I guess a real quick history of municipal water privatization, which is what's being discussed in Chicago over the last maybe 10, 15 years in the U.S., and then talk about some of the basic critiques of it that we put out there and what's happening in Chicago. So in a nutshell, water privatization came along in the last 20, 30 years in the U.S. Privatization of municipal water systems, like lots of other stuff that was being privatized, as part of this philosophy that got out there of having corporations handle all sorts of things for us. And the big kick into water privatization in the U.S. actually happened around 97 because of a tax law change that made it easier for multinationals to buy up water systems in the U.S. for long periods, I think 20 years or more. And so the three big water companies in the world, which had been around for decades and decades, United Water, RWE, and Veolia, Suez, and RWE, they were German and French companies. They, at that point, felt that it was worthwhile to finally get into the U.S. market. They already owned systems in France and in Europe and some other places around the world. Suddenly, they wanted to get in the U.S. Now, it's changed since then. RWE bought a company, a subsidiary in the U.S., and then it's called American Water. Then they unloaded it a couple years later. But at the time, these were the three big ones. Now it's pretty much Suez and Veolia. So they jump in, and they start to try to purchase up large cities' water systems. And the big example, the first big flagship was Atlanta. I think that was 1999. It was a 20-year deal that they struck to operate and manage that system. 4 years in, it had gone so badly that they canceled it 16 years early. There are a number of other disasters, and we found that they started to take a slightly different approach after only a few years in the U.S. market, which was, instead of going for big cities, they were going for small towns and trying to clump together small systems. And that was a response to people rejecting privatization of water systems in large cities. In New Orleans, it was rejected before it was the knot was tied. In Atlanta, like I said, it was canceled because it worked so poorly. And then the last bit of history, I would say, is that I think what we're seeing now in Chicago in the last couple of years in the Midwest is a new stage, a sort of shift in their approach to municipal water systems, which is because cities are in such dire straits financially, and water infrastructure is aging so badly, these companies are approaching cities and offering a new privatization model, which is the lease, which is to say, you need money, you can't upkeep your system, let us give you a big chunk of change, and you'll hand over your system for 75 to 100 years. And it's, as you can imagine, a really tempting offer. And it hasn't happened yet with a water system in the Midwest, but this is the third big city to be approached. So what I would say about the process when this happens, in a word, is that the privatization process is often fast, happens quickly, as you all have seen with the meters last year. There's usually a financial advisor that's hired beforehand, and that's an important step. They sort of grease the skids and help the privatization go forward. They're supposed to be considered a fair arbiter of the deal, but oftentimes they encourage it. Oftentimes there's little public input until the process is well on its way. And then, of course, in every case, it happens differently based on the unique politics of the location, Chicago being a completely different animal than Milwaukee or Akron. The basic concerns and messages we try to get out there about privatization, given that we advocate for public ownership, is first that you find service suffers, also poor staffing. 2, local control is a big concern because when decisions are made in a far-off boardroom, there's less accountability and transparency. And then another one, of course, is rates. private utilities in Illinois and throughout the Midwest charge on average 15% more than public drinking water systems. In some states, like Delaware, the average is up to 80% more than public systems. And so one message we try to get out there when cities consider this is that we see water privatization, or the water lease, certainly, as sort of a taxing through the tap. Because cities often say they don't want to raise taxes, but what they're doing is they're taking the big chunk of change from the company, handing over the system, and allowing the company to jack up those rates and withdraw the money back out of residents' pockets anyway. Atlanta, as I mentioned, I want to talk about Atlanta, Akron, and Milwaukee. Atlanta wasn't a lease, which is the model of water privatization that's been discussed in Chicago and was attempted in Akron and Milwaukee. It was an operation and management contract. But in Atlanta, some of the problems we saw were poor management. There was a backlog of 14,000 work orders. Jobs were cut, as I mentioned, from 700 to 300. And the claim is that private corporations can do this more efficiently. But what we found is that often they make cuts for the sake of saving money, where there should be more staffing in order to ensure safety and good service. And they underestimated the management costs, the company did. So that what sometimes happens is a couple years into a contract, they go back and they say, it's actually going to cost us $80 million more than what we thought it was to operate your system. And then they renegotiate the contract, and that happened in Atlanta. So in 2003, that contract was canceled, and it became a big black eye for private water companies in the U.S. So fast forward to 2008, as I mentioned, the companies shied away from larger cities, but continued to purchase up smaller systems. And I should say that 86% of people in the U.S. receive their drinking water from public systems. So, but in Akron, the approach was different. There, this is where the lease model came up. So the city needed money. Instead of saying we're going to pay this company to provide a service, the company's going to come in and pay us, and it's going to take over the system. And the mayor claimed, Mayor Plisquelic, that he wanted to use that big influx of money to set up a scholarship program for students. Folks quickly jumped on the plan and opposed it, and it was defeated in a referendum vote. So this is one approach that we advocated for opposing this, which was to say we helped folks in Akron run an initiative campaign saying anytime you want to lease off a public asset, you need to put it before a public vote for referendum. Folks in Akron overwhelmingly turned down the option to privatize their system and overwhelmingly passed an ordinance saying that anytime it's tried in the future, there must be a public referendum automatically. And so Akron was a big success. A year later, the issue came up in Milwaukee, and this was actually just under a year ago. Again, a system that worked really well and was financially doing fine and providing a good service. This time it was the drinking water system. In Akron, it was wastewater. And opposition was very strong. I know when I first went to town and met with council members and aldermen, I met with one who said, we will hire a financial advisor for this. But they said, these guys have an incentive to ensure a deal goes through, these financial advisors, because they get a percentage of any contract that's cut. And so we try to get the message out that they're not a fair broker and this and that. Actually, by the time you get them hired, it's only going to be closer and closer to privatizing the system. And council wanted to wait until after they had a financial advisor and more information before they had a public discussion about this. So we put together a coalition, include Union, AFSCME was involved, Institute for Wisconsin's Future was another organization, Sierra Club, a number of neighborhood associations, and we started to advocate in city council against this and say, we wanted the lease off the table, but at least we didn't want the city to waste the residents' money on a financial advisor that was going to be biased.